Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I actually decided to go with this title, being Jack the Ripper, and maybe if you don't know what the research is about, then it might be a little bit puzzling, but I chose it precisely for this effect, and hopefully it will become clear why this title makes sense in a bit. Okay, so I will go right into the describing what this research is about. But what I would like to start with is Jack the Ripper, right? So I'm pretty sure, I'm fairly confident that that most of you, if not all of you, heard the name Jack the Ripper, right? So it's something that you might be familiar with. However, I don't know to what extent you know about the facts of what happened during those events, during this Jack the Ripper event. So what I'll do first is I'll take you through all of the key events, and so it's more like a historical part than a linguistic part. So everything happens in Whitechapel in London, and the year is 1888. And so I'll start with I'll give you a timeline of the events. So most of the experts start the series of events with the murder of Martha Tabram in August 1888, which was followed by another murder at the end of the month of Mary Ann Eccles. Now, these two women, most of the literature would characterize them as prostitutes. Certainly, they were working as prostitutes, but the extent of that has been challenged by recent research. So that's why I will refer to this as opposed to other literature as women. So these women were, there was this series of murders, and they were all characterized by similar aspects. So for example, they were all at night, and there were mutilations of the bodies. So it's similar, relatively similar to each other. There was another murder in September, 8th of September, Andy Chapman. By the way, we are approaching the anniversary, and you will probably hear the name Jack the Ripper more and more every year around this time. That's when new books come out and all of that. So crucially for what concerns us and this research is that on the 27th of September, the most important letter in this case was received, a letter that is nowadays called the Dear Boss letter, and that's the first page. You can, I mean, if you want to see it, you can just search it on the web. You will find scans of the letter. So the letter basically says, yes, it was me who murdered Annie Chapman. I'll do it again. You never catch me. That kind of thing. And more importantly, this is where the name Jack the Ripper comes from. So it's this letter is signed, yours truly, Jack the Ripper, and so you know, the name that you know actually comes from this letter. Very importantly, just you know, a few weeks later, well, a few days after this letter was received, the so-called double event happened. So two women were murdered at the same, you know, relatively close to each other in terms of time in Whitechapel in London, and with similar characteristics. And because of what the letter said, it looked like it was. They made the letter sound more authentic, as meaning coming from the real killer. And importantly, this double murder was followed by another text that was sent to the Central News Agency. I'll explain that in a second, and which is nowadays called the 𝗳𝗵𝗲 𝗟𝗂𝗀𝗃, and that's what it is. So it's literally a postcard, not a lot of text, and it's signed as Jack the Ripper as well. And so the 𝗷𝗿𝗱 letter was saying that a piece of the ear of one of the women would have been sent to the police. This was not done, so the letter justifies that in a way, the postcard. In October, something else peculiar happened. The so-called Whitehall mystery. So the torso of a woman was found in Whitehall, and actually, I think in the Thames. And subsequently, another letter was received, and this letter is nowadays called the 𝗵𝗲 letter. What you see here is not a picture of the letter, because no one has ever seen this letter. So it's an important detail to bear in mind right now. So what you see here is just a text. The text was copied word for word by Bulling, one of the journalists at the Central News Agency, which the Central News Agency was a news agency at the time that received all of these communications that I showed you before. And for reasons that are not known yet, Tom Bulling decided to, instead of sending the original to the police, to make a copy, a word-for-word copy, and send that to the police instead. After that, another important event was the receipt of the From Hell letter on the 16th of October. This is has been popularized by the phrase "From Hell," which gives the title to the movie with Johnny Depp, and I mean, actually before that, the graphic novel of the same name. This came with a half a kidney, I think, and with the famous phrase, "Catch me when you can." Then in November, another murder, the one of Mary Jane Kelly, happened again in London. This was actually indoor. It was the most gruesome one, with all the organs removed. And there were other women that were murdered again in Whitechapel, like Alice Mackenzie. And finally, I mean, not finally, but finally for today, another torso was found about a year later, a year after all these events. Again, the torso of a woman similar to the Whitehall mystery. And I could go on. So it's so Victorian London, and especially Whitechapel, was not a nice place to be at the time. So many horrible things happened. But nowadays, not all of these things are attributed to Jack the Ripper. So it's actually only these murders are recognized as being Jack the Rippers. And the reason for that, so all of this this kind of analysis has been done by experts, commonly referred to as ripperologists, so historians, or not necessarily academic historians, who are fascinated by this case. There is one academic publication on this that was written by some profilers, let's say, so experts of offender behavior, who noticed that actually there are elements in common across all of these murders, to a way that is more than what you would expect by chance. However, the reason why I laid out all of these events is because I suspect that not many of you knew about the torso killer, right? This is something that it's equally horrible and gruesome, but not many people know about. And it's still a mystery, so nobody knew who the torso killer was. but everybody seems to know Jack the Ripper, right? And you know, the reason for that, to me, my personal take is because of this letter. So, and because of the name that came with these letters, that created this image that is very powerful and that persisted across more than a century. So the key point here is that many horrible things happened. To be fair, there's no hard evidence that connects all of these murders, right? So there's no crucial bit of evidence. There's nothing in these letters that only the killer would know that would necessarily indicate that these murders were committed by one person and by the same person. So the only reason why we talk about one killer is because of these letters, right? And this piece of research only came in relatively recently. And although it kind of validates that, it's not based on solid evidence. It's one piece of evidence, but especially given how far away it is in time, we would need many more pieces of evidence to be sure that there was a Jack the Ripper that committed all of these murders. So this is everything we know. There are a few things I want to tell you about the letters first. First, a crucial thing to bear in mind is that at this point in time, so right after this, basically right after the 𝗖𝗵𝗂 𝗟𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗀 was received, the police decided to publish these two letters, the 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗀𝗀 and 𝗖𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗀 𝗟𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗀. So they made copies and they hang them outside the police stations, and they authorized newspapers to replicate, to reproduce them. And they were hoping that someone would recognize possibly the handwriting or something about the language that could say something about the killer. And although before this point, only 4 letters were received about this murder, so these 2 plus 2 other letters that I haven't shown you yet. After this point, and within this span of time, so only from September to November, 130 letters allegedly from Jack the Ripper were received by various recipients across the UK. So not necessarily in London. There were letters that were sent in Manchester, in Birmingham, Scotland, and you name it. So all over the UK. And of course, it's very unlikely that that was actually Jack the Ripper that was sending these letters all over the UK, right? And in total, what we have now is a collection, or well, in this case, because it's text, a corpus of 209 Jack the Ripper letters that were sent from the earliest on the 24th of September until a decade almost later. And there are other cases, even more recent, of Jack the Ripper letters that are sent. And again, clearly, most of these letters were not written by Jack the Ripper. They were almost certainly written by hoaxers. So this is everything we know about Jack the Ripper, really. So these are the facts. So if whenever you hear the name Jack the Ripper, you think about something like that, this has no basis in anything real whatsoever. Okay, so the characteristically, the top hat and well, the long knife perhaps, yes, but this kind of figure never existed. And so we have, nowadays we have Jack the Ripper tours, right? Actually, Jack the Ripper tours started right after the murders. So it's probably the oldest, attraction that related to Jack the Ripper. We have video games, and some literary scholars argue that Dracula was, so the novel, Bram Stoker was directing the Lyceum Theatre when all of this happened. And it's argued that that was the inspiration for Dracula. There are movies. The London Dungeon has got a Jack the Ripper attraction. recently a museum. And then, as I said, every year there's a new book with a new theory. I mean, not every year, I mean, possibly every month. So especially around the end of August and beginning of September, that's when we get the news that someone finally solved it and we know who Jack the Ripper was. But the reality is that we don't even know if there was a Jack the Ripper, because we have no evidence that all of these matters were connected. Right, so all of this is fascinating, and I think it hasn't been studied by historians enough. So there are all sorts of things we can talk about, the social, cultural aspects of this phenomenon. In terms of the kind of things I care about, I care about the text, the letters, right? So the question is, who wrote these Jack the Ripper letters? We know of only one writer. Okay, so only one person was actually found out as being an author of one of the Jack the Ripper letters. This is Maria Coroner, a young woman who was charged with sending 2 letters signed as Jack the Ripper. So and essentially what she said was that she was fascinated by the case and she did it as a joke. Now, it's very possible that most of the authors of these letters, they were trying to be Jack the Ripper for a joke, or just to be part of this kind of series of events. There were also other letters are clearly, I mean, you can clearly understand why they were sent. Some people send them to their neighbors if they if they were not cleaning up the trash or something, that Jack the Ripper is coming to kill you or something. So there are all sorts of kind of motives, and it's extremely unlikely that any of them actually came from the killer or one of the killers. What is interesting is, I mean, like everything started with that Dear Boss letter, right? So that's where the name Jack the Ripper comes from. So what is fascinating would be to find out who wrote that letter, right? So who started the whole thing of Jack the Ripper. And the theory is that it was a journalist. So it's called the enterprising journalist theory. And this comes from the 𝗏𝗏𝗏 letter. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 was in Scotland Yard, so it comes from a pretty reliable source, so someone that was involved in the investigations. And we have Inspector 𝗏𝗏𝗏 saying that the term Jack the Ripper was generally believed at the Yard that Tom Bullen, so this is an alternative spelling of Tom Bulling that I showed you before, of the Central News Agency, was the originator. So it was a smart piece of journalistic work. So essentially, Jack the Ripper was one of the most successful scam in history that is still generating revenue for some people, right? So whoever publishes books about it. And it comes from journalists that just wanted to sell more newspapers, right? So this is the time that tabloids were founded in the UK, and it's basically the origin of fake news in a way. So the Central News was receiving these letters, and it's believed that it could have been an inside job. So it was them; they were faking that they were receiving them. And then they were selling this news to newspapers, and that's what kept them going. Now the Central News Agency eventually closed down because they were fabricating news. So there are interesting bits that you can read in newspapers of the time. They were accused. They were found out that they actually were fabricating news. So there is an element, at least there's a connection. It's a plausible theory. So as a French linguist, one of the best things you could do here would be to find out something, to have a collection of Tom Bulling's writings and then compare them with the Dear Boss letter and see whether there is any linguistic evidence that Tom Bullen was actually the author of that letter. But unfortunately, we don't have that. So one of the things that so the kind of things that I set out to do were mostly because of the absence of this known data. So one is there any linguistic evidence that among those texts that were received before any of them was published, that some of them or all of them were written by the same person? This is important because if we find out that two or more of them were written by the same person, then we can take that as a cluster of writings that are connected. Second point is, if there's any evidence that connects these letters, the pre-publication letters, then can we link these letters with other letters that after the moment that they were published? This publication date is important because after that point, we can't be sure whether the similarities we see in the text are due to people just copying, plagiarizing from the pre-publication text, or just because it's the same author, right? So we have to be careful about that point in time. Okay, so this problem is a problem that is called in the literature author clustering. So when you have a collection of texts, and what you want to find out is you want to group these texts according to their authors. And so that's the name it goes by in recent literature. There's not a lot of literature. This is a new kind of authorship problem, and it's actually pretty difficult. In addition, this is made even more difficult by the fact that these letters are very short. So the average text length of a 𝗪𝗃 letter is 83 word tokens, and the minimum is 7. So there are some texts are extremely short. What you normally do in authorship analysis when you have a problem like that to solve is you count the frequency. You count words and establish frequencies, average the expected frequency of, for example, function words or other words. But you can't really do that when you have short text because relative frequencies become meaningless. So what I did instead is I used the Jacquard distance, which is a way to measure similarity, or in this case, distance between texts, just based on presence or absence of words in this case, right? And I looked at specifically, I looked at word bigrams, right? So combinations of two words together extracting using a moving window. And so if you have two texts here, so it's just toy texts, the way you calculate that is by looking at the number of elements that have in common divided by the number of elements that either A or B have, and then you have 1 minus that. So in this case, for example, the Jacquard distance would be 0.57. So if you do that, then you can create something like that. So what you see here is a network graph, and so each circle is a text. These are the 4 pre-publication texts, and the size. So I made the size of the circle proportional to the text length. So the longest text is Dear Boss, and it's also the largest circle. Then each link between one circle and the other is a word bigram, okay? And the similarity, or in this case, the distance between the texts is reported with the Jacquard distance. So for example, these two texts over here, they are very different from each other. The distance is almost 1, so it means completely different. And that's because they only share one word bigram, which is I do. But you can see that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗟𝗔𝗘, which is the smallest text, and Dear Boss are actually linked by a lot of word bigrams, and their distance is lower than any other pairing. Okay, so it seems like these two texts are more connected than the other. Okay, but is this is this evidence that these two texts were written by the same person? It's very hard to say just by looking at, those numbers. So what I did is I looked at those bigrams that were shared in more detail, right? So what is it that is shared, and what can we say about the distinctiveness of these word bigrams that are shared? By the way, if you do this study for all of the texts, right, then you can make something like that, which is this is like a tree, it's a dendrogram, but instead of it just made as a circle, because otherwise it would not be readable if it was like a tree. But you read it in this way. So you start from the center, and this is a branch, right? And then this is another branch. Each branch is a cluster of texts that are very similar to each other, right? What we see from, just by glancing at it is that the two earliest pre-publication letters cluster over here, and all of the letters that were sent to the Central News Agency cluster over here. So they are, quantitatively more similar to each other. But as I said before, these numbers are meaningless unless we actually see what they mean, right? So I took all the data I possibly could take from of 19th century English. So 𝗂𝗏, which is American English, but it could still be useful, the corpus of late modern English texts, and the extended Old Bailey. And I explored this corpora to see to what extent those kind of word bigrams that are shared are distinctive. Okay, so this is a list of all of the bigrams, word bigrams that are shared between 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗂 and 𝗂𝗵𝗂𝗂𝗁. And now what we can do is go through one by one and see, okay, is this a piece of linguistic evidence or just chance similarity? Some of them, like a bit, for example, are probably worthless. I gave these are just the English language to get. 𝗬𝗨 starts to be interesting because it means that both of the authors of these texts, they use til instead of until, right? Trying to is it's very hard to understand, but one thing is certain, that it's not very frequent overall, right? So it's something that could be important. So that's why I'm marking this in orange, right? So it could be important because it seems like it's rare. And to work, where work means to kill, is also probably distinctive, but it's very hard to quantify because it would mean going through all of the instances of work and manually label them. So it's almost impossible. But finally, this one is starts to become very interesting. So this letter back 𝗬𝗨, so these are actually, it becomes a 4-gram, but it's a combination of two bigrams. This is virtually unique to these two texts. So you will never, this is a word 4-gram that you only see in these two texts in the history of corpora. Okay, so if you looked it up, look it up on Google, for example, or look it up in any corpus you won't find it. And this is, well, this is insane, right? Because there's nothing here that is referring to 𝗁𝗏𝗃. These are just 4 words that you could see in other texts. But this combination of 4 words, it's like it's something we don't generally try to avoid in French linguistics. It is like a fingerprint that connects these two texts. So we can answer the first question. We can say, yes, actually, there is very solid linguistic evidence that connects 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗂 and 𝗂𝗵𝗂𝗁. So these two texts, they were not in public domain when they were received, which means that because of these similarities, it's almost impossible that they were created just by chance, right? So that's why we can say, okay, there is very solid linguistic evidence that they came from the same person. But now what we want to know is, can we connect any other texts in the post-publication corpora to this cluster of two texts? Well, what we can do is, first of all, reason quantitatively. So we have, this is what you see here is a box plot of the Jacquard distance. So for example, 𝗔𝗶𝗍, the median distance is more than 0.98. Okay, so most of, no, it's not like 𝗬𝗏 where the median is 1, which means that most of the texts are completely unconnected to 𝗬𝗏. 𝗔𝗶𝗍 is one of the most imitated, reproduced texts in the entire corpus. So that's why you don't see almost all of the texts in the 𝗂𝗏 corpus have some connection to 𝗔𝗶𝗍 because that was the inspiration. But when you look at the most similar, so which means the lowest score, well, first of all, we find this one, but this one is a plagiarized, it's a plagiarized instance. So there are chunks of text that are identical to 𝗔𝗶𝗍, so we can just ignore it. The second one is 𝗬𝗏, and we know that because we know that they are very similar to each other. And then we have 𝗬𝗏, which is the other letter that was sent to the Central News Agency. If we look at 𝗬𝗏, the most similar letter is again 𝗬𝗏, and then 𝗔𝗶𝗍. So it looks like 𝗬𝗏 is actually connected to these two texts. And what you see here, these are all the word bigrams again that are shared by either 𝗔𝗶𝗍 or 𝗬𝗏 and 𝗬𝗏. And again, what we see is that there are lots of bigrams that are just English, right? So I do a bit, the police, although this one is a bit questionable because most of the 𝗂𝗏 letters refer to the police as pigs or cops or coppers. So the fact that all of them use the police is also could be distinctive, but it's hard to tell. They also share my work. So work used to mean to kill, but this is actually, remember that we're talking about the post-publication letter. So that means that 𝗔𝗶𝗍 was in public domain. Many people became familiar with this way of meaning work and meaning kill. So it's not that distinctive. And we know that because if we look at other 𝗂𝗏 texts, then we find it in 14 of them, for example. Similar idea for grand work, which is one of the key 𝗂𝗏 phrases. We find it in 3 other 𝗂𝗏 texts. Haha, okay, so this sort of evil laughter we find in 8 𝗂𝗏 texts. And the beginning, 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗀. So this is one of the most distinctive phrases in 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗀, and we find it in 55 𝗂𝗏 texts. But check this out. So what we see here is we don't see exactly the same foreground in median. So in median, we see keep this back till 3 are wiped out. But we definitely see the similarity here. Right? And finally, we have this other combination, this other almost a foreground that again doesn't appear anywhere. So it's a combination of words that is only in common between 𝗬𝗏 and median. It looks like in the history of humanity, but of course it's not that we have corpora to test that, but definitely in all corpora we can test today. So what does this say? Well, is this evidence that the same author wrote 𝗬𝗏? Yes, but it's not as strong as this one, because at this point in time, 𝗔𝗶𝗍 and 𝗬𝗏 were in the public domain, right? So we cannot discount the possibility that one of these hoaxers was so skilled in being 𝗂𝗏 that they managed to replicate this level of similarity, although it's very unlikely, I would say. And there is, I mean, the evidence points to this letter as being written by the same person as 𝗔𝗶𝗍 and 𝗬𝗏. So what conclusions can we make for the historical aspect of this research? So for the hunt of 𝗂𝗏, if you want, right? Well, this is actually new evidence. So it's the power of forensic linguistics in this case is that all of the other evidence is corrupted. So we can't look for fingerprints, we can't look for DNA. There have been some DNA work, but it's questionable. And but language is the same, right? So it's uncorrupted by time. So but interestingly, it's not telling us anything about the killer at all. So we're not talking about the whoever murdered those women in 1888. We're talking about something that is at least equally interesting and significant, which is the phenomenon, like the social cultural phenomenon of Jack the Ripper, right? And in the same way that if I present my evidence to a jury, it's up to the jury to understand what this evidence means in context. This is a matter for the historians to solve. So the significance of this linguistic evidence for the historians is something for the historians to judge. But the Evans and Skinner, who collected these letters, say, so this was in 2001, they say, if 𝗏𝗵 is attributed to the same author as the others, then this essentially is a piece of evidence towards the fact that they are hoaxes. And this is because the themes and the motives of these letters are very different. And so again, because of other reasons, they are not linguistic. Personally, I think that we should address not the question of who was Jack the Ripper, but who created Jack the Ripper. So it's much more fascinating and probably fruitful academic pursuit to study this particular aspect of the Jack the Ripper story. Now, what about linguistics? What about forensic linguistics? What we see here that is fascinating is the presence of this foreground that we don't see anywhere. Okay, so again, I please do and look out for it. You will see that you will be redirected always to Jack the Ripper whenever you search for this. Well, this reminds me of something. So if we remind ourselves the definition of a lexical bundle is a sequence of word forms that go together and that they are not structural units and or something that a speaker would recognize as idioms, but they recur in a register and they are not idiosyncratic. Well, this is kind of similar, but in another way. So this sounds to me something like an idiolectal lexical bundle, if you will, right? So it's a combination of words that reoccurs in an author, not in a register, right? And that is a way for that author to realize a specific function. So is this evidence that something like idiolectal lexical bundles exist? It's possible. Even more interesting, if we look at 𝗏𝗵, what we see here is that it's not the lexical bundle that appears again. What appears here is just the selection of linguistic units, right? So we have keep, keeping, keep, this plus this, letter, back till I, right? So what we have in common is the lexeme, the lemma, keep, followed by the semantics of letters. So the head of the noun phrase might be there or not, or it can be pronominal, but it's still the semantics of letter. And then we have back and till, and then, till heads a clause, right? So, and this reminds me of something else. It reminds me of a construction in the construction grammar sense. So what Goldberg would say, there is a linguistic pattern that joins form and meaning in a way that is not predictable. And it's similar definition by B, the sequential chunk of language. Constructions usually have open slots and semi-closed slots, right? Which is very similar to what we see here. And so the question is, do we have idiolectal construction too then? So do we have sequential structures with fixed or open positions that one and only one individual conventionally use? So what we see here is potentially evidence for that. So I set up, So the way, essentially, the way that would work would be that there is this kind of meaning that we want to express, which is don't send letter until something happens. And there are all sorts of possible, well, in this case, possible main verbs to choose from. And if you choose keep back, there are other choices here. For example, where you put the object and the particle. And if you put the particle in a position, then whether you have a subordinate clause or not. And if you have a subordinate clause, whether you use still or until, right? And when you look at all of these choices, the result is a construction that is idiosyncratic, it is unique, right? Because just a matter of probabilities in a way. So what I did is I studied whether this could be true, right? So I examined the same corpora plus I added the Archer corpus, which is actually quite small, and the Dickens corpus, and of course the 𝗟𝗃 corpus as well. And I looked at all of these verbs followed by, or with a span plus or minus 7 of letter as a lemma. What I saw is that the majority of times that this kind of meaning is expressed is 𝗏𝗏 is used. Keep back is a second, actually, followed by keep, and then the other ones are quite uncommon. So it's not that uncommon, okay, but definitely not the default choice. In the 𝗟𝗃 corpus, only one author, I think, comes close to that, and they use keep this quiet, which is not exactly the same, but at least there is this kind of meaning. No other letter has this kind of rhetorical move at the end of saying, 𝗏𝗏 this letter until I do more. I think it's only these two, and it gets close, but not there. So these are all the instances of keep a letter back, right? That I could find. And the thing that immediately jumps out is that there is you can see there is some sort of idiolecto sense, right? So it looks like there are authors that use keep back and probably authors that don't. And one of them, interestingly, is Dickens, which is not a suggestion that Dickens was 𝗟𝗃, by the way. So Dickens was a user of keep back in the context of letters. But when we look at all of the choices, so for example, if we look at, okay, out of these instances, how many of them have the object before the particle? We have to exclude passive instances of passive keep back because there's no way to tell. But for the other ones, most of them would use the object, interestingly, would use the object after the particle, even though they could have done the other way too, right? So, Mr. 𝗏𝗏 keeping back the letters, keeping the letters back, could have gone either way. There's no like predictor there that would push for one way or the other. Then if we look at the presence or absence of subordinates, again, we just exclude all the rest. There's only one left where also the last choice is included, which is till. Keep it back, till, right? But the problem is that there is a pronoun here, right? So we know that pronouns, this is a skewed example because we know that pronouns tend to come before particles. And we don't know what this author would have done if there was a noun phrase instead of a pronoun there. So we don't see any example of that, essentially. But of course, we would need much bigger corpora to test this, to have more concrete evidence, but we don't find any. So what kind of conclusions can we make for linguistics and forensic linguistics? Well, if this analysis is correct, that these letters were written by the same person, then we have this question, right? So do idiolectal bundles or idiolectal structures exist? And this is not a rhetorical question, right? So this is a genuine question. Is there such a thing? What we see is that we have this word sequence is virtually unique in billions of words. And we have this construction that is also possibly unique, although, we don't know that for certain. But the most crucial thing to bear in mind is that this is all despite almost 200 hoaxers trying to imitate 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏's language and plagiarizing 𝗷𝗂𝗍𝗀𝗀 and 𝗂𝐶 𝗥𝗏. So this is almost an experiment in linguistic individuality, because you have this corpus where everyone is trying to be 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏, okay? And they want to scare someone, or they want to, they want to make a joke to the police. So they're trying really hard to be 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏. And you can see that they imitate the language of 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏. You can see that quantitatively and qualitatively, but none of them manages to get the most distinctive thing, the most distinctive 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏 thing in those letters, which is this construction. And of course, the only exception being those letters that are repeated and where the evidence is authorship for all the reasons that I explained before. So the consequences of this study for linguistics, for forensic linguistics, are actually important, at least in terms of suggesting a sort of direction of research. And so that's all for me today. The only thing I want to add is that if you want to read more, then there is my paper in digital scholarship in the humanities. You can find that on my website. And you can also download and use a 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗂𝗏 corpus, which again you can find on my website. And yeah, see whether you find out anything else interesting about 𝗥𝗏𝗍𝗄𝗏. Thanks, everyone.